All right, everyone. Welcome to another Land Effects Weekly webinar. My name is Andrew Spearing, and I'll be your host and moderator today. If you're new to Land Effects, we're here to make your workflow more efficient so you can spend less time documenting and more time designing. We have developed a set of tools that seamlessly integrate with AutoCAD and SketchUp to cut your documentation time in half. It's one thing to develop those tools, but it's another to actually educate you on how to use them appropriately. So we have a number of online resources for you to check out. One is our Power Tips that we publish every week that highlights a user suggested feature. And we also have our weekly webinars training. A couple of those that I like to point out in the next couple of weeks are our CAD Basics Part 2, which is next week, presented by our very own Brian Frederick. Part 1 you can find in our webinar archive. And then the following week, I'll be presenting on tools for large-scale planting plans. I really want to draw your attention to one that's coming up in April, and that is presented by our CEO, Jeremiah Farmer, on the updates to SketchUp 2014 and some of the plans that we have for that. We've been really looking forward to them releasing it, and are excited to see where the SketchUp 3D modeling solution goes, and we do have some great plans for that as well. But today we are talking about SketchUp and Podium. We have Ryan Monty, who is an expert 3D modeler. He's been helping us out for the last couple of years with some of our webinar presentations, and he's also helped us develop our 3D SketchUp library, where he's been making some amazing trees that work not only with SketchUp, but also he's designed them so that they work seamlessly with Twilight and Podium and some other rendering tools that are out there as well. He's a double major from Michigan State in horticulture and landscape architecture, and he currently practices design and 3D modeling at Nature's Way Landscaping. We're really excited to have you here. We're excited to have Ryan. And if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to add them in the questions module on the right screen there, or on your control panel. I'll be collecting those and asking those to Ryan at the end of his presentation. So thanks again for joining us, and Ryan, take it away.
Hi, like he said, I'm Ryan. I want to thank you all for coming today. As I run through the basics of Podium and how to set up your scenes from start to finish, and hopefully I can show you how to do it so that you don't spend all your time modeling and rendering and taking all day. A lot of these renderings only take a couple hours from start to finish, from model all the way to end result. So a little bit about Podium. It's one of many rendering systems out there. This particular one uses what's called ray tracing, where wherever your viewpoint is, it simulates straight rays going into the model and then kind of interpolating how they interact with the materials when they hit them. Other programs will use what's called photon mapping, where it'd be like if you took a bunch of marbles and threw it at your model, like where would the marbles bounce, essentially. But this one uses ray tracing. It works entirely within SketchUp, so you don't have to like export your model to a whole nother program and work at it from there. So it makes it easy because there's no like back and forth, which is really nice. And one of the great things about Podium is it has what's called automatic textures, where all the standard materials in SketchUp already have your rendering presets attached to them. So if you paint your model with the SketchUp standard materials, it should render realistically with the automatic presets. So you don't have to spend a lot of time going in and changing all your materials and tweaking them. So it saves a lot of time because you only have to do 2 or 3 test renders before you can do your final one. And it also has its own browser inside of the program, which has a lot of cool materials and models that people have built. That does cost extra. It's like $50 or $59 extra, but you get a lot of cool stuff with it. But it still has some free materials in there. And then you can also do animated walkthroughs. That's another add-on. I can't remember how much that cost. But since I don't really do fly-throughs, I never really use it. So it's good that you don't have a feature that you don't use. So that is kind of nice. And some notes about modeling. I'll explain more as I go along, but you don't have to like clean up your stray lines and like get your model perfect when you render it, because a lot of those lines, if it's just a line, it has no thickness, and therefore light doesn't actually hit it, so it doesn't exist. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. And texture selection's really important. Like if you make your own texture, like that'll make the difference between it looking real and looking not. Because if you can see like seams in your textures, it sort of takes away from the realism. And I'll show you how to make seamless textures later. And since you're basically simulating how light actually is hitting things, scale is important. So it's important to build your things at how big they actually are in real life. So I know some people in the SketchUp libraries like build their models like 2-3 times scale just to make it easier as they model, but it does weird things if you try and render those. So that's something to watch out for. And another thing is layers are very important. So it's good to like turn off what you're not going to be looking at in your viewpoint. And like if when you turn on shadows, it's good to have the same scene with the shadows on, one with the shadows off, in case you have to make changes, because sometimes it's hard to like make changes when you have shadows turned on. Start small, and that goes for when you render. You want to start with a small resolution when you do your test renders. For example, if you double your height and width on your output image, you have 4 times as many pixels, so the computer takes longer to render it like that. So you start small, and then once you have all your materials set up, then you do your full-size render. And there's always experiment and practice. You know, it took me a while to get to where I am, but you know, hopefully after showing you this, you can get more of a head start than I did on some of this stuff. So moving along to some examples. Here we have a scene that basically I just built in SketchUp, applied the automatic textures, and clicked render, and this was the output image. You can see like reflections and stuff like that. But one of the things to watch out for is in SketchUp, when you model arcs and curves, they aren't true arcs and curves. They're made up of straight line segments. So one thing to watch out for is if you have curved surfaces, you'll have to increase the number of sides, you know, so that it doesn't look like all these straight line segments in there. And here's what I was talking about earlier when you don't have to clean up stray lines. Here, this is just a PNG I did in Photoshop and imported into SketchUp, and they're transparent edges, and then this is the edge of my component here, and I stacked them into this tree here. So then in Podium, when I render, all of those stray lines disappear, and all you see are the colored surfaces in the middle here. And along with that, sometimes you'll import a model and it just looks terrible because all you can see are the edges. But what's great is you can export this or render this in Podium and you get something like this. So suddenly you can't see all these line edges in there, and it can really clean up your model without having to go in and hide every single one of these lines. So that's a good feature. And then a lot of these rendering programs work the same way pretty much. The only difference is that they're a little bit different in how you set up materials. Like this is another model I built and rendered in Twilight, and then I set up the materials the exact same way in Podium and rendered it this way. And a lot of the language is the same between both programs, and there's really only a few things you really have to focus on when you're setting up your scene, and I'll explain that in this example. So if we can just jump to SketchUp here. So here, if I just exported this SketchUp scene as is, this would be the final image result. That's not that great. Basically, all it is just a little table with some jacks on it. And when I mention scenes, I always do a scene without the light and then one with the light. Because in this view, if I go to do anything or make any changes, it kind of lags because it has to, deal with the shadows. So do all your work in this scene without any of your lights on. So after you install Podium, this is basically your Podium workstation. Let's get rid of that. So there's only 5 buttons, so it makes it quick to learn. So this will start on this side. This is your light button. This is how you create all your lights. You choose what type of light it is. I'll go more into this later. You choose the power. You can select your light color and basically the cone on your light. So I'll go into this in the next example. Here you have what's called the Podium browser. They've got a lot of cool textures, a lot of cool models that are already optimized for rendering in Podium. They have all sorts of furniture, anything you could imagine. But a lot of this stuff is part of the paid content, but you can show just the free stuff if you click on this. And there's still a lot of cool stuff in here. They have 2.5 dimensional plants and various 3D trees that you can use just to kind of add a little variety to your stuff. And it's real similar to the SketchUp library, where you can bring in your components from there just by doing a search. And then this is your options, where you can control your output. You can select what type of rendering you want, what you want to export, what format. Usually I just do JPEG. And then image save location is pretty important. That whenever you click render, that's where all your renderings are going to go. So I've created this folder called Podium Renders, and then anytime I click render, even if the render doesn't finish, the partial will be in this folder. So it's good because sometimes you'll get a lot of stuff and then you only pick out the 2 or 3 that you really like and need. So that's where your image save location is. And then when we go to environment, I don't really mess with any of this stuff too much. I just leave it the default. This is how you set your sun. So I always just go default set in SketchUp. And then when you click on view shadows, and you can change the time and the date, and that's how I set up my sun. So whatever shadows you see here are basically what you're going to see when it renders. And I always turn off this soft omni lights because it takes 3 times as long to render, and all it does is just blur your shadows, and I don't think it really adds much. And then you're going to want to make sure this automatic materials is checked on, because that's what that'll automatically, every time you paint a standard SketchUp material, it'll apply the presets to make it render correctly. And then here, this next button is your material selector. So I've painted this one glass, this one metal, and this one stone. So if I open my material selector and click on each one, you'll see that these little bars move around here. So if I click on this glass one, diffuse, transparency, reflection all change. And basically, in these rendering programs, light is conserved. So whenever light hits an object, it does one of three things. Either it hits the surface and it's rough and it kind of like scatters everywhere and blurs. That's what's called diffuse. Um, so that basically gives you your fuzziness on on your material. And then transparency. So that's like if light hits your object and goes through. And then reflection is if light hits your object and bounces off. So these should never add up to be more than, these three combined should never add up to be more than 100. Otherwise, your rendering will look weird because there's more light reflecting off of your object than actually hitting it. So, which would not ever happen in real life. And so, anytime you have like a transparent material, you want to go in here to where it says refraction. And this is like when light hits a water and bends, it's got a certain refraction value. And you can change that in here depending on, what you want to simulate. And basically, the denser your material, the more it's going to bend. So if you hit none, light will basically just pass straight through it. But if you want it to like simulate what light would actually do and like refract and like basically act like a lens, you're going to want to raise this value. So the higher it goes, the more light will bend as it hits your object. And then on this one, since it's metal, it's going to be shiny. My reflection value is going to be pretty high. And since it's not totally smooth, but it's really smooth, I've put this light or this diffuse at 10. So the higher that goes, the more kind of rougher you're making your metal, essentially. And since it's metal, I don't want to see through it. My transparency is at 0. And then for this one, I've decided to make it kind of like a plastic type material. It's kind of blurry, so it's not totally smooth, so I'm putting the diffuse up to 72, and it's moderately shiny, so I'm going to put my reflection somewhere around 28 here. And it's totally opaque, so transparency 0. But since I'm putting the diffuse up so high, I want it to like be a little bit bumpy, so I throw my bump depth basically on a texture. Everywhere you have a dark spot, the program's going to simulate that it's a cavity and make it appear like it's like a bump, essentially. So the higher this value, the more it's going to take these shallow areas or these dark areas and make them look like holes, essentially. So if we go around, we'll change all this stuff. I've changed the wood that they're sitting on. Got my glass set. I got my chrome set and my plastic set. So now what I'm going to do is go back to my options, and this is where I'm going to choose what type of rendering to do. So you have all these selections. Basically, I usually start with exterior preview, because most of our scenes are going to be done outside, and these are essentially sitting on a table outside. So if I do exterior preview, default background set in SketchUp, and then if I do my image size output, I can choose a resolution, and I'm going to want to start low because I'm not sure if this is actually I actually have the materials set right. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time rendering and re-rendering trying to get my material perfect. So if I start small, it'll render quickly, and I can see what it looks like. So I click on this ball here, and it basically says render, and you'll see what happens is it brings up this this window that says processing scene, and it'll basically compile your image and start the rendering. And then it'll bring up another little menu down here where this is your rendering manager, where every time you start a scene, it'll appear here, and you can double click on your window here to take a look at this preview. So it'll go through, it'll throw light at your object, and then refine the edges and anti-alias and do its thing there, and you'll see that that took 20 seconds to do. And it looks pretty good to me. Make sure your sun is on though. And so basically, that looks pretty good. So I'm going to want to go back into my options here and set my image size to viewport. So basically what I see in my SketchUp window is what's going to render. And this is going to be like 1200 by something, I think. It's based on whatever your desktop resolution is. But basically, so if I render that, there's the preview render, and then this is what the final render looks like. And as you can see in the preview render, it's all like choppy down here and in here. This is just a quick little thing to make sure everything works right. And then this is the final image where it's all nice and smooth. Everything looks good. I've got good reflections. I can tell the light bends as it goes through this glass one up here. And that's basically how you set up your standard scene. And if you want to go higher in higher in quality, you choose this exterior high. So preview takes the least amount of time. This exterior normal takes a moderate amount of time, and then exterior high takes the most amount of time. So with the preview, it took like 20 seconds, and then if I do it on this normal mode, this model will take around 4 minutes to render. And then if I do it on high, it takes around 20 minutes. So a lot of that's based on your processor speed. So it could be, quicker if you have a faster computer, or slower if you have a slower computer. And then, so what if you want to do a scene at night though? I'll show you how to set up your lights with that. Let me just go to my lights model here. So setting up lights in SketchUp is pretty easy. Let's see, I just want to get a normal style here. There we go. Okay. So I've basically just arrayed these lights out here just so you can see how they render at the end. But to do a light, normally I make a circle. I don't know, we'll call this 1.5 inches. I usually divide it and then just draw a line straight up from there. And then I'm going to make that a group. This will help me aim my light down the line. Because as you can see, this is a light, and sometimes it's hard to know where it's pointed or if it's angled correctly even, because you can't really see what it's doing just by that. So I've made this thing. I mean, it could even just be, something like that. Just to help you aim your light object. So I've made that a group. But this is the one I prefer most. So you're going to click on your light item here, and it'll bring up your light system. So you can choose your light type, the power, the color, and then this what's called cone. So usually for outdoor landscaping at night, I'll do a power of 10 or 15. That seems to work pretty well. The higher you go, the more light it outputs. And then since we're doing a directional light, we're going to pick a spotlight. OmniLight basically makes a sphere that throws light in every direction. That takes a little bit longer to render. So I just usually use spotlights. So here I'm going to pick on color, and it'll bring up this or my paint bucket window. And I'm just going to go to colors here, and then pick like a nice soft yellow as my color, just to kind of simulate a incandescent bulb outside. And then this basically, if you ever see a light, it's not like, they don't have hard edges. They usually kind of taper off as they go from inside to outside. So this inner cone is the angle at which your bright center is. So it's going to be a 15-degree angle extending out from there, which is bright. And then it's going to have like an outer cone of like softer diffuse light. And I'll show you an example of that here. So if you look here, this big light has like a wide outer angle and the same inner angle. So there's no fuzziness along the edge of this. So it's like a nice hard edge, which sometimes if you want. And then this one, you can kind of see there's a bit of fuzziness here, and it's smaller and smaller and smaller, and I work my way down. So, and you can change this even after you create your light. You just have to edit it. So I go back to my model here, and we're just going to stick with this 1545, and that's usually pretty good. So we'll click Create. And then what that's going to do is it's going to give me this red dot, and you want to click on the outside of your light, then go to the middle, and then from there you're going to want to just go straight up. So that creates your light. And then I'm going to want to select those and group them together. So now I know I can move this basically any way I want. I can unglue it here first. So for these, I'm just going to tip them at like a 45-degree angle. And then that way I know which way they're pointing. And then I can move them here. I can copy them and move them around. And then if I ever want to edit them, I can just click on the light, and it brings up the presets for that light. So this one has a 5-degree inner cone and a 10-degree outer cone. So half of this light's basically going to be diffuse. And then I look at this one, 10 and 15, and then 10 and 20, 10 and 30, and then this is the one where it's 30 and 30. And that's basically how that turns out here. So with night scenes, you're going to want to do these a little different. If you just click render, it's going to be daylight and you can't tell what's going on. But if you go over to your styles, Podium adds what's called Podium styles. And these are all different nighttime sky simulations that you can do. So I'll click on that, pick my scene, and then I'll render the viewport, export as a JPEG. I'll do exterior preview, and that looks good, and then I'll click render. And then it'll compile my scene, and then I can check on my rendering in progress here, double click on it. And then it'll give you a time left remaining over here too. And there you go. So 20 seconds. And then that's basically how lights work. And if you notice, you can't actually see the physical spot where the light is coming from. So if you want to like show like a lighting fixture, you'll have to like build one. And the Podium browser actually has some exterior lights. Usually though, I just build my own because most of them, are nothing I would probably ever use in a landscape. So with that, I can move along to doing a full landscape scene. So here we've got this model that I built. As you can see, every scene I have one with a sun and one without a sun. So I just kind of threw this together and made sure automatic materials is turned on. And if I go through and click on all these things, you'll notice my glass has the presets on it. The water, oops. If it's in a component, you'll have to click into it to check on it. So for the water, I have it set diffuse, transparency, reflection, and then I have the refraction rating set to water. And then I wanted to make it a bit bumpy, so you have to click apply and close. And then I basically got all my plants on its own layer. Everything else is on the 0 layer. And a lot of times when I'm doing a scene, I'll always put like a backdrop on it, because otherwise when you render, it's just like you can see to infinity. So it's nice a lot of times to put like close off your horizon so it's not as apparent. So if we render this basically as is, if I turn off my automatic materials, just so you can see what this looks like. Here's the SketchUp view, and then this is basically what you would get without any materials added and without any trees. Looks kind of bland. So we're going to go in here, oops, turn on my automatic materials. Default output view. I'm going to do a small rendering, basically exterior, and then, oops, that's the next part. Basically, you're going to get something that looks like that. So you can see how relatively quickly you can get realistic looking things with, without a whole lot of time involved, because basically I just painted it and it automatically picked all these materials for me. But one thing you'll notice is on this pool, if you zoom in, it's like the water's all wavy, but there's still a straight edge along the end of the concrete there, which kind of takes away from the realism if you're seeing a bumpy pool. So what I do for that, I'll go into my thing here, and then I basically want to make a grid on there. So I'll copy that over, divide by 20. And then I'll copy this one over to make my grid. So now that we have a grid, we can do something really cool here. If we go up to Tools, Sandbox, Smooth, I get this giant red circle. So I'm going to want to make like a 3-foot radius on that. And what I can do is come in here and pull and push and grab these edges like so. Just do that across the surface. I'm going kind of extreme with this just to kind of show you, maybe it's a windy day or something. So you basically just come along and you basically break up that straight edge. And you can also use this same technique for like modeling hills if you wanted to. But in this case, it's a pool. So we'll kind of rough up the surface just to kind of keep this edge not so straight. And if we render that, now my edge has some waviness to it, and that's how water would actually be in a pool. So going back to my main scene here, I've got my new bumpy water here. I'm going to want to make sure my sun is turned on. All my materials are set. And generally, I don't worry about grass, because grass is really hard to render for basically all of the programs. So I usually do that in Photoshop, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. So everything's set. And I'll come up here, set my small viewport, do a test rendering. And it basically looks like that. And then I'll do my full rendering, and that's what it looks like. But I don't like how smooth this grass is, so I'm going to want to fix that. So for that, I'm going to go to Google and basically type in grass. And you're going to want to find an image of grass that kind of matches, like, prospectively what you're going for. Okay, so how about this one? That looks pretty good. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to save that to basically, yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So we're going to open that in Photoshop, and we are going to open this image in Photoshop. Where did it go? There it is. Open with Adobe Photoshop. So here we have my image, and we're basically going to take this, select everything, copy it, and paste it right on top of the other one. And in order to do this, we're going to turn the opacity down so I can see where the grass is. And we're going to just move this up a bit, stretch it out to get the grass, this top edge of the grass, to fill in there. Okay, that looks pretty good. And then we're going to turn that off for a second. And we're going to, normally I would go in and select this a lot cleaner. But I would go in with the fine lasso tool and select the outline of my grass, like so. So now that that's selected, I want to delete everything else. So I'm going to do select inverse. And if we go to that layer, change the opacity all the way up, hit delete, it's going to delete everything except that selection. But that's way too dark there. So if I just turn the opacity down a bit, Yeah, I'd say that looks pretty good. Um, like I said, you're going to want to take a little more care than that to clean up your edges. But with that, you basically get that. And I would call that a pretty decent rendering. Took me about an hour to build, and then probably another hour or so to render and put the grass in. And all these trees and stuff um, are just pre-made components. I'll show you where to get a few of these. I've been working with Land Effects for the last couple of years developing some of this stuff. Um, and like I said earlier, textures are really important. You could see how like a texture with seams would kind of break it up and make it look not real. You can see this brick texture doesn't have any seams anywhere. Um, and that I did using a little trick where if you go to Google, let's say I want a concrete, brings up all these textures. That looks pretty good. So if I save that, and then, but if I go in to SketchUp and actually, file, import, and then I import that concrete texture, oh, cool, that looks pretty good. But if I, try and fill in a bigger space, you can see all these seams where the texture itself repeats, and that's not good because somebody looking at that would be like, oh, well, the texture is repeating. So for that, you can go back into Photoshop, and then if I get my concrete texture open with Photoshop, boom, there's my texture. Yeah, I'll close these other ones out. So we want to make this seamless. The easiest thing to do is take your image, go up to Filter, and then go to Other, and then tell it to offset. And you can pick how far it offsets. Basically, you want to get your seam here somewhere in the middle. So what it does is it basically wraps your image around to the other side. And you can do both vertical and horizontal. And in this case, it looks like there's no real seam running this way. It's just this way. So now that I've wrapped it, I can say, okay, take my clone stamp tool, and I usually turn the flow down a bit, and then you hit Alt to grab a sample spot, and you basically color out that seamed area. So now if I go to Filter, Other, Offset, now there's no like definite seam in there anywhere that I can just pick out at a glance. So I can take that, save as. Usually I save them as PNGs just because they tend to work better. PNG, save, and then I click no interlacing. So now if I go to my SketchUp model and import that texture, and I did it again with this wood texture, now if I paint a bigger area, the seam isn't quite nearly as obvious, but you can still kind of see a seam. So it takes a little bit of practice to get them totally invisible, but I'd say that looks better than that. And usually if you're painting a large area, you're going to want a large area texture image to help try and avoid that small repeating texture over and over. So it basically went from this to that, and then from this to this. It doesn't look like there's a whole lot of difference at a glance, but making them seamless can have a huge impact on your SketchUp model. And now you can, a lot of textures I just download from Google Images, and other times I just search for them in the Google library. Like I know Unilock does like concrete pavers, and they have swatches for basically all of their products. So I've saved those into my library. So that saves a lot of time doing that. Um, but yeah, it's always good to have a library because the less time, if if you aren't having to like make your texture every time you use it, that saves a ton of time too. Um, and some final thoughts about modeling. More geometry, of course, is going to take longer to render. So if you have like tons of plants, it's going to take longer to render than if you just have like a rectangle on the ground. The faster your processor, the faster your render time is. More lights take longer. Um, the bigger your output image, the longer it's going to take. Like I said, if you double your width and height, you have 4 times as many pixels. So it takes 4 times as long to render. And then higher render quality, of course, is going to take a longer time to render. So you want to start with your low render quality and move up from there. And in terms of detail, if you're far away, you don't need to like model in every nut and bolt in something because you're never going to see it. Basically, anything you wouldn't be able to see with your naked eye standing somewhere, you don't need to render. But if you go in close, there's a lot more. You have to pay attention to how like the grain of wood interacts around edges of stuff. Just look at furniture around you, see how that's put together and how the grain changes as it goes around the edges of it and stuff like that. And don't spend a lot of time modeling like windows on the other side of your house if you're never going to render the scene. And as I said, create a library of materials because that'll save a lot of time in the long run. Basically, all the trees and shrubs you see in here are in a library for me. So if I just go here, all these trees, I can just throw in, as soon as I need them. I don't have to go hunting for them or search them down everywhere. Oh, my sun's on. That's why everything is going so slow. So if I turn that off, everything should move faster now. So there's a hydrangea. And you can actually get some of these models here that I've made if you go to the Land Effects website. If you go down to this corner here where it says News and click on that, if you scroll down a ways, did I pass it? Here it is, 20 new SketchUp models. So if you go to that, you can just download this whole folder of trees. And these have all been optimized to work in Twilight, Podium. They work in a program called Circathia. So you don't have to worry too much about having to fiddle around with these because they should work. And then you just click on this and you can download the entire folder of things and then put them in your SketchUp library. And these are all set up to where the canopy is on a different layer than the tree trunks. So you can turn off the canopies to help speed your modeling. So with that concludes our quick overview of Podium. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Down the road, you can email me if you have any questions too. I usually check my email a couple times a day, so I can, offer tips and tricks, or if something isn't working, I can offer suggestions with that.
That's fantastic, Ryan. That was an awesome presentation, and hope you all enjoyed it out there. And Ryan mentioned you can download those trees. They're also available in the Land Effects SketchUp plugin that you can download for free from the SketchUp warehouse. And if you're we also have the plugin, the SketchUp connection. So if you are working within AutoCAD and you have a planting plan that you're working on or design, you can export all of your plants in the exact location that they appear in AutoCAD directly right into SketchUp, and then you can start rendering your scene from there. So definitely check out the SketchUp plugin that you can download from the same page as the 20 models, but you can also look for it on our website. Hey, I had a quick question. Feel free to, if you do have a question, put it in the question module over there. When you're doing, Ryan, when you're doing the uh, placing the grid over your water, could you go over that just really quick and then possibly
Oh
talk
yeah.
about the difference between components and groups?
Okay. So basically, to get that grid, what I did is, let's say this is my pool rectangle. I just clicked on the edge and then copied it over. But rather than do like 6 inches and like have to do that a bunch of times, all I did was moved and copied it directly onto the other edge. And then when you know how you can do arrays, like move it 6 inches times 10 times, you can do the same thing in reverse. So if you move something a length, you can do forward slash, which is divide, and I'll say divide by 20, and it'll divide that into 20 different sections. And then I just do the same the other way, move, copy that all the way over to the other edge, and then since it's twice as far, I did divide by 40. And then that gives me my grid. And then to move it around, I go up to Tools, Smooth, and then down in this lower corner, it gives you a radius. The smaller the radius, the fewer of these intersections that you'll be able to interact with. So if I do like 20 feet, whoops, if I do 20 feet and hit enter, I'm moving a whole lot of these at once. Whereas if I do like 1 foot, I can only move, 2 nodes at once.
Awesome. And then when you did that in the demonstration, it automatically updated your other scene. Could you
Right.
explain for some of the beginners in the audience how that happened?
Yep. So if I select everything and hit G, that makes a component that's different from grouping. Um, so if you just right click and say um, make group, I'll show you how this works. So if I do that, um, and then I like edit this one, uh, nothing happens because they're both unique models. But if I come here and tell it to make it a component, all instances of that component in the model are the same. So anything I do in this one automatically happens in this one. So it's a good way to like, if you have to change one, like if you have to change a light fixture and you've got 50 light fixtures, if you make them all the same component, you only have to change one light fixture and it updates them all. But if you do a group, you would have to edit them all individually of each other. Does that make sense?
Yes, that was an excellent explanation. And that's just another way to speed up your
Right.
modeling time. And it also, I would imagine, reduces file size as well. Is that correct?
Yes, it definitely does. Um, Generally, if I'm doing something that's has some symmetry to it, like a left and a right side, I'll um, I'll make the component and then cut it in half and then copy it and like mirror, if you can mirror image by, you know, flipping it along one side, and then like as I edit it, which way did that flip? Flip along right. There we go. So now if like, you know, if this were like a chair or something, you know, now it's two halves of the same thing essentially. So that cuts down on file size too, rather than, you know, having to model one side and then have to model the exact same thing again. You can just model half your chair, which saves a ton of time.
Smart. Could you show us quickly how you go about adding a backdrop?
Yes. So this backdrop, um, I've had forever. I can't remember where, who or where I got it from, but basically, um, you go online, you find like an image of a tree line, and you go into Photoshop and you basically make a transparent background and edit out the sky and cut that out to make it clear. And then what I've done is I import that image into SketchUp and then project it onto this curved face here. So like if I were to go like this and make an arc, I generally do curved surfaces just because they look more natural in your SketchUp model. So if I go like this, I'll go to all these nodes here. Come on, why isn't this making a face? There we go. So basically, you build your curved surface like this, and then you would, let's see, file, you would import your image. I don't happen to have it handy, but if I import this grass one we just did, and I stand this on end, and this is sort of why you make a library, because once you have them, you don't really ever have to make it again. So for this, you would just stretch it to kind of match your thing, your curved surface, and then you would basically paint bucket it onto your screen there, and then you want to make sure it says projected. And since my image is so small in relation to the big thing, it's going to be all choppy. But ideally, you stand it up, and then you project it onto your curved surface, and then tell it to say project this small standing image in front of this. And then you make this a component and delete your other thing. And then once you get it done, you just say save as, and then you have your library of stuff that you can save it to. And then anytime you need it, you can go into your thing and just drop them all in. So I've got one This is a park. This one's a mountaintop. So now that I have them, I don't have to like make a new one every time.
So I imagine that would work really well for specific sites as well.
Yes, yes,
If you're working on a residential project, you can maybe think about the scene that you want to render and take an image on site and then do this application within SketchUp.
right.
Have you ever used Google Street View for doing anything like this?
I have
Background.
not,
Okay.
but I'm sure you can because Google Earth and SketchUp work pretty well together because you can export files like the KMZ format right to Google Earth. But I've never done that, so I don't know the entire process behind it.
Very cool. Well, thanks for showing us that. Any other questions? We had a couple questions just about land effects. The land effects is an add-on to AutoCAD and SketchUp. So we provide the workflow from AutoCAD into SketchUp, and then you can use Podium to do the rendering. Um, and so anything that happens within AutoCAD can be translated to SketchUps for this quicker rendering. And then also for any of the CAD LT users out there, unfortunately AutoCAD has a limitation on AutoCAD LT, so it doesn't allow any third-party add-ons, which land effects would be. So we do have an FX CAD. We do offer that, which is a full version of AutoCAD. It's at half the price. So if you are in the market for a new CAD software, if you want to upgrade from LT, we definitely recommend it, and we're offering it at half the price. And in that way, you'll be able to have the SketchUp connection. So that really speeds up your workflow. Looks like we have a couple other questions coming in. Thanks for those guys. One from Tim. When would you, Ryan, when would you recommend using Twilight instead of Podium?
Um, Personal preference. Twilight can do animations, I guess, and I guess Twilight's half the price. Um, or maybe if you had a lot of like glass, I could see you using Twilight because Twilight has a um, it's called photon mapping, which is a little more accurate when it comes to glass and water. But I guess it all comes down to just personal preference. Uh, download both trial versions and try them and find out which one you like better.
Does one render more quickly? Is one a little bit lighter?
Mm, I would say Twilight renders a bit quicker because you have more control over what render setting you choose. You can choose like really low render settings in Twilight, whereas in Podium you're limited to these like 10 or so. But in Twilight you have, so if I here, let me go to my Twilight. So here, if I go here, I've got 11 here, another 20 there, a whole bunch here, and then my animation. So, but you can choose like really low settings in Twilight, whereas I think the lowest you can go in Podium would be about medium, I'm guessing.
All right, great. I think that's going to actually be probably another webinar that we do with you, since there's some additional questions about Twilight.
Actually,
And
I think
this
I have done a webinar on Twilight.
and so that would be located in our webinar archive, which you can
Yep.
find on landeffects.com. Click on videos, and the first option is webinars, and you'll see a link to our webinar archive at the bottom there. Ryan's done another a couple other webinars, as you mentioned, Twilight, and he did an excellent one on how to create trees in SketchUp. So
Yep.
that's another great resource for you to check out. I do want to lastly just mention that our SketchUp plugin is available now. You can download that on our website. If you look under features, SketchUp, you can actually put this in. I'll put it in the chat box here so all of you guys can check that out more quickly. Download that now. Our 2014 SketchUp 2014 webinar will be next month on April 11th. That's with our CEO Jeremiah Farmer. Definitely check that out. It's going to be an awesome presentation on some of the developments that SketchUp has done in their latest release and some of the plans that we have for our SketchUp plugin in response to those updates. So definitely take a peek at that. And also our power tips. Definitely want to point those out to you. Our latest power tip was on spline support. So as Ryan mentioned earlier in his presentation, that SketchUp really doesn't handle curves very well. So we came up with a way to support that, and you can export splines directly into SketchUp using our SketchUp connection. So check that out. I will post that tip as well in the chat box down here. If there aren't any other questions, I just want to thank you again for joining us today. Ryan, you did an awesome job. Can't wait to have you present again. And if you have any questions for him, there's his contact information on the screen.